We are talking about Brave Girls today, and we have a lot of amazing authors to speak to. So we're going to start right away with introducing our panelists. Panelists, we have a lot of information on our YouTube underneath with links and information, so your introduction can be brief. We're going to start with Eden Royce. Would you go ahead, introduce yourself, the book you're promoting, and anything else we should know about you?
Okay, my name is, as you said, Eden Royce, and I typically write Southern Gothic, which is a great intro to root work, a historical magic practiced in the African American community, and that is a great segue into my novel, Root Magic, which is a middle grade Southern Gothic about courage, friendship, and lots of Black girl magic.
Amazing, thank you. Let's go ahead to Gabrielle Byrne.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gabrielle Byrne. I am in the Pacific Northwest today, and my story is Rise of the Dragon Moon. It's about Toli, who's the princess of a frozen queendom, and she has to fight to free her mother from the clutches of treacherous dragons. So it's a dragon story, and I write middle grade fantasy and fantasy for young adults.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Sayantani, you're up next.
Yeah, so I'm Sayantani DasGupta. I'm the author of the Kiran Mala and the Kingdom Beyond series, the first book of which was The Serpent's Secret. The second book was Game of Stars. And the third book, which came out just as the pandemic hit this year, is The Chaos Curse. The series is about 12-year-old Kiran Mala, who thinks she's just an ordinary immigrant daughter living in New Jersey. And that all of her parents' stories about her actually being a princess from another dimension are not true. When on the morning of her 12th birthday, a kind of villainous, terrible rock kush monster storms into her kitchen, whisks her parents off to another dimension, and she has to go off on an adventure with some princes on winged horses who show up on her front doorstep to rescue her family, but also really discover the strength about her own identity and her own self. So this is a series that's based on Bengali folktales that my grandmother told me, and string theory, because why not? You know, Bengali folktales and string theory, perfect together. So.
Yeah, lots of things to learn there. Amazing. Josh, how about you?
Hi, so I'm Josh Roberts. I'm the author of The Witches of Willow Cove, which is upper middle grade, twisty-turny, supernatural mystery kind of story about 6 brave girls with magical powers and several of their friends who don't have magical powers. And it's there's mystery, adventure, magic, danger, and a lot of bravery, a lot of friendship. And it's my debut novel.
Congratulations. And last but not least, Kate O'Shaughnessy.
Hello. I write middle grade fiction, contemporary mostly, and my debut is The Lonely Heart of Maybelle Lane, which is a story about a girl who really wants to meet the father that she's never known. And when she finds out that he's going to be judging a singing competition in Nashville, she decides that despite so many obstacles and so many fears and so many things that are holding her back, that she's going to sign up as a contestant and figure out a way to get up there. And it's to compete in the contest. And it's a road trip story, coming of age. It's about friendship and found family and all that good stuff, and a lot of emotional bravery. So I'm very excited to be here to talk about bravery today.
We're so lucky to have you. Well, thank you, everyone. So I have so many questions. I am kind of fangirling over here. I know I won't get through all of them, so I apologize if I cut you off at any point. But we're chatting about Brave Girls today, something each of your books speaks to with your powerful protagonists, as you guys have mentioned. To start, I'd love to know a bit about how each of you would define bravery and how you started kind of embedding that into your book and your characters. Can we start with Eden again? Do you have to put you on the spot?
I am always first. For me, bravery defined, it's courage. It's doing something when it is incredibly hard for you to do for whatever reason, whether it's nerves, embarrassment, fear. There are lots of reasons that you could feel like not doing something, but that bravery is feeling that fear, feeling that worry or that stress, and choosing to do it anyway. as far as incorporating it into root magic, which is based on lots of Gullah Geechee folk tales from my people in the Gullah Geechee corridor of the United States, it's something that we've had to face living in the United States with lots of barriers that are put into that community, and just living and surviving and being able to practice your magic, practice your spiritual rituals. Those are things that are not always looked favorably upon, and choosing to do those things anyway is an act of bravery in and of itself.
I think that's beautiful. Thank you, Eden. And Sayantani, your novel touches upon very similar themes. Do you want to speak to that and your definition of bravery, how you embedded that in there?
Well, I would 100% agree with you, Eden, that bravery is being afraid but doing what needs to be done regardless. And I think that's what Kieran Mala really does. And I also love that your definition or your discussion of bravery also incorporated ideas about embracing and celebrating one's own identity despite racism, despite xenophobia, despite any other kind of forces from the outside which tell you that those identities are somehow lesser than. And that's really Kieran Mala's journey as well. What I love about fantasy is that you can kind of talk about things at multiple levels. So on the one hand, there's an actual monster in her actual kitchen, right? Ripping apart her cabinets and eating the toaster. And although in the book, that's a rock kush monster, what I often tell students when I go on school visits is I'll say, when I was an immigrant daughter growing up, it wasn't a physical monster. My rock kush was racism. My rock kush was people telling me that somehow I was lesser than because of what I looked like or what my skin color was or where my parents were from. And so in the Kieran Mala series, there's both kind of adventure at the level of fighting monsters, but at a deeper level, it's also about kind of fighting anything that threatens you and your identity, that threatens your family. And it's about finding the bravery to instead kind of embrace and celebrate all the different parts of your identity.
That's wonderful. And Josh, your protagonist, Abby, she finds out that she's a witch. So similar in that way of like coming to terms with your identity. What did you try to weave in terms of bravery when it came to Abby and other characters?
Well, first I would echo what's been said before. I definitely agree that is that sort of sense of doing what needs to be done, whether you're afraid or uncomfortable or intimidated. But I think also in my book, a lot of it is about standing up for yourself, standing up for your friends, standing up for what you believe, when the path of least resistance is to do nothing and to say nothing. And I think, to not cause problems. And I think the other thing, particularly that Abby encounters, is people in positions of authority in her life that she's been told all her life to trust. And she's at that age where she's beginning to question, should I necessarily trust these things blindly? Should the stories that I've been told all my life about how things are, about which forces within the world we should trust and are trustworthy, should I actually do that? Should I believe the same things that I've been told to believe all along? Or is there another path that I need to take? And I think part of her journey and all of the characters in the story is figuring out who you are and how that's different from what you've been taught. And what do you keep? What do you change? And then also, just the bravery of, she encounters a teacher who is going to teach her everything that she needs to know, but she's not sure if she can trust that person. And then deciding whether or not to trust and who to trust, I think, is a big theme as well.
Okay, thank you, Josh. And Gabrielle, you similarly, Princess Toli confronts some big obstacles. Can you talk a little bit about her bravery?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that really, I'm sure you saw me like nodding vigorously, but that issue of trust is really a big one in my story as well. Toli's culture reveres dragons. And for Toli, her experience has been wholly different from that of most of the people around her. And it really, with her having sort of a position of authority in her queendom, she is forced to face that belief system and sort of challenge it a little bit and try and find a way to make peace with it in a way that helps her and helps the people that she's responsible for. And I also think there's an element of sort of being willing to accept your vulnerability that comes into being brave. Tolly really has to acknowledge the mistakes that she's made, but she also has to find the strength in herself to realize her value. And that takes her a really long time, and it takes the people around her to help her do that. So, you know, there's both an element of being vulnerable and being able to see yourself as a flawed person and having that be okay, and also beginning to understand what it takes to trust somebody and to find value in others and to challenge that when it's not, when they're not living up to your expectation.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And Kate, sorry, last again, but not least. So your character kind of does something similar when she goes on a search for her father. Can you talk about what bravery means to her and if you share that same definition in common?
Yeah, you know, I think for me, in terms of my definition of bravery and how I looked at it in this story, I think that to a certain extent, being brave is kind of on the opposite spectrum of staying in your comfort zone. And I think that generally books will do that, right? Like a character is on a journey that requires them to step out of that safe bubble. And Josh, what you were saying about these questions about your mentors and whether they're right or wrong, like I think that questioning that is like innately an act of bravery, right? Because it not questioning it and just accepting it is much safer, and you don't really have to do a lot of change if you don't ask those questions. And I think for Maybelle, you know, it's not so much a quest or an external catalyst that sort of sets her off on her journey. It's this internal drive and desire to meet and know her dad. And I think that she is able to do a lot of things. You know, she has really bad stage fright, so signing up for a singing competition in and of itself is a very scary thing. She suffers from panic attacks, which I think also, like, to set off on such an unknown journey with no idea of how it's going to end is really brave. And I think that willingness, and I think probably reflected in all of your characters on their internal journeys, the willingness to continue to pursue that goal and that hope is so brave, right? Because it requires such a leap of faith, and that leap of faith takes them, I think, often way outside of their comfort zone. And I just think I think that's really, really brave. And Gabrielle, what you were saying also about, you know, vulnerability, I think that is, for me, you know, writing more about emotional bravery, not so much physical bravery, like jumping off a cliff or doing things like that. I think being vulnerable is the bravest thing you can do. So in my story, that's definitely, you know, her ability to be vulnerable is something that I think is a true act of bravery. And anybody that can manage it, it's hard.
Yes. And we could all use a little bit of bravery now, especially. So this next question, I'll start with Josh. So growing up presents many challenges, and that's what middle grade books usually focus on. And each of your protagonists encounter unique obstacles, but also some that seem very familiar, whether it's looking at this dragon and seeing, you know, anxiety or something along those lines. Did you share any of the same struggles as your main characters growing up? And if you did, why did these stories seem important to tell?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, being a 44-year-old male. And, you know, with my my protagonist is a 13-year-old girl. And I think I've always felt really comfortable. All of my, you know, growing up, my mentors and my influences were women. By junior high, most of my best friends were girls. And I think I can vividly remember, you know, sort of bullying going on in junior high with, you know, this insult being hurled at me, like, oh, you're such a girl. And it's like, why is that an insult? And I remember feeling very strongly like, you don't know what you're talking about. It's not an insult. And I think, like, for me, it's just being the truest expression of who you are and being comfortable with that, and being sensitive, being brave, as we talked about. That is sort of like the heart of what my story is about. And although I didn't have the same experiences, you know, literally as Abby growing up. I think all of my characters are different expressions of different parts of myself, and I think the bravery that they show is being true to who they are and putting themselves out there in those ways.
That's great. Sayantani, would you like to go next?
Sure. The question is kind of what I share with Kieran Mala. Is that the
Yes. Yeah.
So I would say that, Kieran Mala wields a bow, she fights serpents, and she fights rock kush, and I don't do any of those things, unfortunately. She hangs out with magical skateboarding, sari-clad resistance fighters. I don't do any of those things. I don't have a a friend who's a tiger who uses they their pronouns. Yeah, I don't have any of those, no friends who are tigers but at its heart, underneath all of the physical adventure, the Kieran Mala and the Kingdom Beyond series really is about an immigrant daughter kind of embracing all the parts of herself and recognizing and going on a journey to discover where she's from. In Kieran Mala's case, she's from a different dimension. In my case, I'm from a different continent that at some points of my life sometimes felt like it was a dimension away. Sometimes, it would feel like a whole new galaxy, a whole new, a whole different world. And, at one point of the book, Kieran Mala's mother tells her, none of us is just one thing, and life's journey is a process of recognizing all of our faces. And I think that's what the immigrant daughter kind of journey to embrace all, of your faces is about. And I tried to infuse that kind of self-seeking, community-seeking, and recognizing that, your superpowers only come when you kind of learn exactly who you are and exactly where you're from. And that's, how Kieran Mala's journey is similar to mine.
Thank you. Gabrielle, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, thinking about the similarities between my life as a child and Toli's, similarly, I don't fight dragons or make epic journeys across the ice with my best friends. I'm not inheriting a queendom, so there's plenty of differences. But I think one area where, it's kind of universal is just the challenge of meeting expectations, where those expectations might be external. They might be someone's expectations of me or of my characters, but also our expectations of ourselves, right? And how we don't always meet those expectations, and coming to terms with that being okay. And with our lives being journeys where we're always learning, we're always growing, we make mistakes, we acknowledge the ways that we sometimes let others down. And I think all of those things sort of play into this idea of who we are as people. And that journey that each of us makes is, it's fun to play with in fantasy, with all of the amazing metaphors we get to use to show fighting monsters, and whether those are internal or external, right? So.
Thank you. Kate?
I think for me, so I know both of my parents. So in terms of the journey to meet her dad, we don't share that in common. But I think sort of what's a universal part of that is, or, what is true for me definitely is the sense that I've definitely had relationships that I've yearned for, like really, really deeply, or ones that, require you to put yourself out there, whether it's a friendship or a romantic partnership or, a mentor, whatever it may be. So I definitely understand that yearning of like, oh, I really, really want this. And I'm willing to put myself on the line and risk rejection in order to get it. And I think that she, for Maybelle, she doesn't know what her dad's going to do when he sees her and meets her, and she sort of reveals who she is. He doesn't know that he has a daughter. And so I think that's a huge, act of bravery to put yourself out there to be rejected by somebody so important, to her and her in who she wants him to be in her life. Another thing I actually shared with Maybelle that I wrote about for the first time, I think like a month or two ago on the Teen Librarian Toolbox, is I also struggle with panic attacks. And for me, they started later in my life than for Maybelle. For May, it started, I think when she was 10 or early in her 11th year. For me, it started in my early 20s. And it's really, really, really scary. And so sort of the meta part of bravery for me, it was, I hadn't really ever talked about it publicly. I hadn't talked about it with any of my close friends. It was something that I carried with me as, for some reason, a source of shame. And writing this book for me was super cathartic and felt like a small act of bravery to sort of put that in there and talk about it and be really open about it. And it's sort of amazing, sort of the results that something like that can yield, I think, both for ourselves and for our characters, to be vulnerable on the page as an author, and then also have your character have that willingness to be brave and be vulnerable in their own story. So those are the things that I would say that resonate most with me about her journey.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
And Eden.
Well, in thinking about this question, I realized I haven't spoken a lot about the plot of Root Magic, but it is a historical Southern Gothic set in 1963 in my home state of South Carolina. So it's right before a lot of civil rights acts were passed. There's a lot of struggle in people trying to find their place in the world. And that's what the twins, who are 11 years old, Jez and Jay, are struggling with, in addition to the decision to learn root work, which is their family magic, because it's not always looked well upon, and the students that they go to school with find them a bit strange, find them a bit weird. And for me, listening to stories from my grandmother and my great aunt about growing up in this part of the world, that was my connection to this story. And I know that over the years, a lot of the contributions of African Americans have been obscured by history. So taking these stories and putting them into Root Magic was a huge connection for me, and something that I wanted to just give back to my community. So that's a huge connection for me. Another thing I think that Jez especially goes through, because she's the girl, and her brother Jay, some of his friends think Root Magic is kind of cool and it's weird, so they kind of accept it a little bit more than some of the other girls in her school. So she's fighting to find a friend who accepts her as she is. And I think finding friendship and finding acceptance for the person that you are is a huge struggle that I know that I went through when I was in school. And I'm sure that it's something that lots of kids go through now for a myriad of reasons, whether it's their continent of origin or whether it's something that they like to do for a hobby that other kids find unusual or strange or unfamiliar. It's just sort of accepting yourself and finding a community that accepts you as well. So that was a huge connection for me.
Wow. And Eden, my next question is more about the root work that your characters do. How does that, you touched upon this already a little bit, but how does that magical system and them like really getting to the root of root work, how does that help them find bravery in their journey?
Well, I think learning a ancient magic that your family and your ancestors have practiced, it gives you a feeling of not being so alone in the world. And a lot of times struggling to find bravery and struggling to find courage, it's something that is difficult because you feel alone in what you're trying to do, or you feel alone and unsupported in what your viewpoint is. So her connection to root work, learning that this is something that her ancestors have done for centuries, that it connects her to people that she has never met before who are still out there but still on her side, and to help her deal with the spirits and the haints and the boo-hags and the creatures that are around the South Carolina marsh, in addition to dealing with the human aspect of racism and intercultural challenges, because not everybody, even in her own community, thinks that root work is okay. So they think it's something that is sort of coming at them from all sides. So does anybody besides my own personal family believe in me or encourage me? So having that sort of ancestral connection is something that helps the twins just feel a bit more brave and feel like they can challenge everything else that's out there.
Wow. Very cool. And so Eden spoke to, trying to find your tribe and trying to find your people. Gabrielle, this next question is for you on Princess Tolly. When she embarks on her journey to rescue her parents, her mother, she is backed by her sister and her best friend. So how do close relationships help us be brave when facing such challenges, or specifically Princess Tolly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for Toli, her relationships, particularly with her sister and her best friend Wix, are a really important part of her bravery, because her loved ones can see strengths in her that she doesn't see in herself. And we don't always see our strengths. We need the people around us to kind of reflect that back to us. And with Toli, she really struggles to see her own value for a while. And she's not the best listener right at first, and so sometimes as she's making this epic journey across this frozen land to try and find her mother, with dragons hunting on the ice and a baby dragon that she hates, and just life really sucks in that moment, And so when she begins to turn that attention to her sister and to her best friend, and sees values, particularly in her sister, that she didn't see at first, then suddenly she's better able to see some of her own value and the way that they work together as a team and sort of amplify each other's strengths.
Wow. And Josh, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, Abby, your protagonist, seems to be dealing with a lot in terms of figuring out who she can trust. And so she deals a lot with trying to find her independence. In your opinion, what is the relationship between independence and bravery?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on this earlier too. I do think that as you go from childhood into your tween years and teenage years, you are kind of becoming the person you're going to be, and you're forming your own worldview, and you're learning that the things that you've been taught are maybe not what you find value in, and you're trying to learning your own and to interpret the world in your own way. And I think that there's so much about becoming independent, an independent thinker, and trusting your own instincts and your own sense of right and wrong is an integral part of coming of age. And I think Abby really faces that, not just with her mentor, but also with herself, with her friends. She forms a new friend group. They're all coming from different perspectives, and they don't initially trust each other all that much. And I think there's a sense of just when you are sort of in this process of becoming a new person, or becoming the person you're going to be, you do have to figure out, what are you putting aside? What have you been told all your life that you no longer think, this doesn't actually resonate for me? I've been told to trust these institutions, but I'm not sure that I can trust these institutions. I'm not sure that they have my best interest or the interests of those that I care about at heart. It's a difficult thing. And I think as Kate mentioned earlier, it is an act of bravery to distinguish that. So I think for Abby, that's where her story really takes, internally, is kind of about who do you trust and when do you trust. And I think also there is a moment towards the end where she has to decide to trust someone that's betrayed her. And that's another form of bravery as well. Like, can you do that? That might be the hardest thing, is to put your faith in someone who has already betrayed you once. And having that sort of empathy and understanding and seeing where they were coming from, and then choosing to trust. So there's a lot going on. It's a double-edged sword when it comes to trust and bravery, but I think that's her story.
Thank you. Sayantani, this next question, I've noticed across all of these books when I was doing my research that there are a lot of mentors or people that give your characters guidance in the books. Who would you name as your greatest mentor growing up or currently, and why?
Oh, I would say my parents. And I say that kind of unabashedly and joyfully as a parent myself of now teenagers. I don't know if my teenagers would say that. But I think that, in the book, there's this line that Kieran Mala's father, her Baba, tells her. He says, we human beings may not be powerful or magical, but the stories we pass on to our children can be. And so my parents kind of filled me with stories, kind of both of cultural lore, like the folktales that these novels are based on, but they also kind of filled me with stories about the strength of my immigrant family and the fact that I came from a long line of, grandmothers who were revolutionaries who fought, to free India from the British. My parents themselves were activists in this country once they immigrated. So I was kind of filled with all of these stories about my community's strength at the same time that the broader culture was kind of invisibilizing or, either never representing or representing badly my community. And, the stories that my parents shared with me, they gave me the strength to kind of hang on to who I was and to recognize that, being an immigrant daughter is in a sense a superpower. And, being from an immigrant community is my superpower. And if it wasn't for those stories and that strength that my parents gave me in kind of rooting myself in who I was, I think it would have been very difficult. It's hard to be what you can't see. And if you never see a heroine who looks like you growing up, it's really hard to ever think of yourself as heroic. And that's another kind of meta reason that I wrote these novels. But I think if we can fill our young people, be we their parents or be we storytellers, if we can fill them with stories that empower them and see them for who they are, I think that's the first step, right, in them finding their superpowers.
Yeah, and what a beautiful thing for your parents to give you. One of the things that I loved so much doing research on your books is when you said, being able to straddle so many different worlds at once is a superpower, and I think you really honed that in this journey. So thank you so much for sharing that. Kate, same question. Did you grow up with any mentors that impacted your life?
Yeah, I think I have to say the same as Sayantani, because for me, it was definitely my mom. I think that so many times when I revisit things where I feel like, oh, this is a little bit of wisdom I have, if I really tug on the thread of where that's coming from, it's coming from my mom. I think little things that I remember being 13 and just having like a really rough time being 13 and sort of, I don't even remember what I was upset about, but I just remember sitting in our kitchen just like crying to my mom about it. And she was like, listen, I wouldn't be 13 again if someone paid me $1 million. I remember at the time it just made me feel so much better because it so validated, the experience I was having, that it was difficult. And I just remember feeling, instead of her being like, oh, it's fine, like it's no big deal, stop making, a mountain out of a molehill. She was like, I recognize the pain and I recognize how difficult it is to be the age that you are. And little things constantly come to me in relationships, and it's just little pieces that my mom has passed down to me, about how you navigate through a relationship or things like that. I find that a lot of the emotional theme and emotional truth in the story are things that I've learned from my mom, and I think that relationship is definitely seen in Maybelle and her mom, who isn't a huge part of the story for the the bulk of the plot, but has that impact on May. And also, I love this question because it's I think that for me, I had an amazing guidance counselor in high school who was also a fantastic mentor. And Mrs. Boggs, who's her neighbor and a teacher at her school who she's never had, so it's not like she's her teacher, but she's aware of her in that capacity, becomes an extremely important mentor for her throughout the story. So I think I infused a little bit of my mom both in Mrs. Boggs and then also in Mama and May's mom. So that for me is definitely.
That was going to be my next question for you, is like, what drives Maybelle to in this pursuit to meet her father for the first time? And it seems like those mentors play a major part in that decision that she makes.
Well, actually, it's not so much, in the sense that, she kind of goes behind her mom's back, who doesn't want her to have anything to do with her dad, and says that, he's just going to be, from the beginning, she sort of tells her, let's not turn this stone over. And so I think that she kind of goes despite the advice from, and Mrs. Boggs, who's taking her on this trip, doesn't actually know. She just thinks she's taking her to compete in a contest that she wants to be in. She doesn't know what the end for the real goal is actually to meet her dad. So in a way, like Josh said at the very beginning, to go against these mentors in a certain way for her goal is definitely an act of bravery. And again, for May, I think it's that desire to have more love and to find more love and to sort of help the loneliness that she's felt since she's moved with her mom, because her mom works 2 jobs, so she's alone a lot. So actually the opposite, but great question.
And so this last question is very broad, so I'll give you a moment to think, but this is for everyone. What is the most important thing you hope readers get out of your books? And for those of you with series, you could look at it as a series as a whole if you'd like. Big question, do I have any volunteers to start?
I'll jump in.
Okay, thanks, Josh.
So I think sometimes the bravest thing you can do is put your trust in other people. And I think that's a big message that's in The Witches of Willow Cove, whether it's Abby trusting her friends or deciding when and when not to trust certain adults. But also, I think just this sense of like having empathy for others and trying to understand where they're coming from. And I think when you do that, it's easier to trust them because you understand their story as well. And everyone brings their own thing to it. And I think that's really at the heart of it is making yourself vulnerable, putting yourself out there, learning to trust. Those are important elements, not just in fiction, in that sort of journey, but in real life as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll all share something in common. Would anyone like to piggyback off of that? I could call on you guys if you want. I think you've gotten used to me doing that. Eden, can I put you on the spot?
Absolutely. I think that in addition to, trusting someone that has hurt you before, one of the bravest things you can do is trust yourself when there isn't anyone else to sort of bounce an idea off of or get advice from, and trust that little voice that's inside yourself that says, I should be doing this, or this is the right thing to do. And being able to go with that, regardless of whatever else is going on around you. As far as taking away from my book as well, I think I'd like people to take away that there is a different culture sort of within the African-American community. I think there's a lot of thought out there that African-Americans don't have their own folklore and they don't have their own mythology. And it isn't true. And I think that there's a lot of Gullah Geechee folklore and stories that are wrapped up in root magic that maybe people aren't familiar with or haven't heard about, because there's this idea that people who were brought to this country as enslaved people, or enslaved once they were brought to this country, that those people don't have a culture or a history to be proud of. And that isn't true. There's lots of music and songs and stories and the way that people live that are still part of a beautiful, rich, deep culture, regardless of how that culture was brought to the United States. So I'd love for people to sort of embrace that and take away that there is a whole nother language and a whole nother culture within something that you may not be familiar with. And hopefully Jez and Jay can bring that to you.
That's wonderful.
So to piggyback off of that, I think the thing I'd like for readers to take away from the Kieran Mala series, which is from Scholastic, by the way, is that we can all be heroes and we all deserve to be heroes of our own stories. And I think that particularly for kids who haven't seen themselves or someone who looks like them as a hero, that's a really important and powerful thing to realize. And I think for their friends, it's also really important to, realize that, hey, if I always see myself in stories, it's actually okay to be decentered and see somebody else being heroic. Like that's also really cool too. So I think that's the message I'd like to pass along. I hope that kids get curious who aren't familiar with Bengali folktales, get curious about Bengali folktales and about the region of Bengal, which is both the country of Bangladesh and West Bengal, India, and recognize that people of multiple religions and countries, share these folktales. And so that's exciting. And the last thing I'd love my readers to go away with is to kind of keep a sense of humor about themselves. These stories are filled with riddles and jokes, and Kieran Mala has kind of a wicked Jersey girl sense of humor about everything. And I think that's really important too. Like, yes, we're doing really serious work, but if we can't also laugh with, those who are on the journey with us, and kind of have a sense of humor and a sense of joy about it all, the journey isn't half as fun. Let's put it that way.
I love that balance.
Our journeys are a lot easier if you can laugh with those who are on the journey with you.
Agreed.
I'll hop in next. I'm happy to go. I think for me, the thing that I hope that readers get out of the book is that loneliness is really, it's fleeting. I think when you're in the throes of it, it can feel like it's just going to be your life, or that it's just a nature of your personality, or whatever it may be. It feels really, loneliness is terrible, and it feels really omnipresent. And I think that, for May, especially, she just has moved in the beginning of the story and is in a new town. She has a lot of trouble making friends in her new school. Her mom's working a ton. And I think that, she goes through this process over the course of the book of going from that place of loneliness to a place of not feeling that anymore. And I think that I feel like a little bit of a broken record talking about vulnerability, but I think that sort of is that secret, right? Like her willingness to be vulnerable with the people that she's going on this trip with, and to be open and to really seek out that friendship and that mentorship is sort of the balm to the loneliness. And I think, so I really hope that readers understand that, whether it's found family or friendship or whatever it is, those people who can become like family are really just around the corner. So because vulnerability is really scary, but it's, so brave. And I think it's the secret to finding love in unexpected places. So
it's wonderful. And Gabrielle, to wrap it up.
Yeah, sure. I think what I like kids most to take from Rise of the Dragon Moon is that everyone has value, and everyone has flaws. And so our, relative goodness or badness sort of shifts depending on the perspective, depending on the person who's seeing us, and depending on how we're feeling about ourselves. And so I hope that kids find in Rise of the Dragon Moon a sense of bravery for themselves to kind of embrace their whole selves and become who they want to be.
That's great. Well, you guys have all made me feel ready to fight dragons and, discover all these things about me and to be brave. So I cannot wait for all your readers to feel the same. Thank you guys so much for chatting with me, and I hope you all have a nice rest of your day and your writing lives.
Thank you so much.
Guys.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.